by people. And that's why we need United Nations and all the intellectual, political capital to be invested to the solution of this problem. The United States today goes through the crisis of the United Nations, of course. It goes to the crisis of the divided nations, unfortunately. And that's a big problem. In Russia, the war in Ukraine cannot be even named a war. You will get immediately arrested for that. And it is called special military operation. But the United Nations Security Council managed to squeeze something even more shameful out of itself. An international dispute, as it was called by the Security Council. You see, and the Security Council expressed deep concern after shelling the Ukrainian cities, after Bucha and all the atrocities that happened in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is, in fact, a direct, blatant aggression, as defined in the United Nations Charter. And the United Nations dare to politically remind that such disputes must be resolved by peaceful means and according to the UN Charter. If there is no cooperation, if there is no trust, there will be no peace and there will be no development. This is what we are seeing in a world where everyone now wants his share of a power game. China, Turkey, India, Hungary, Brazil, as well, of course, as Russia and the United States. Shameful, yes. Has the United Nations thus outlived its utility? No. Firstly, it has never been ideal. Neither was not planned to be ideal. It was planned not to create heaven on earth. It was created to prevent slipping to hell. And I would say it was quite successful through the decades after the Second World War, with some exceptions, of course, but it was successful, not always, not everywhere, but generally it was. Secondly, because a very small part of its, let me say, GDP of the United Nations goes to the Secretariat. And everybody is talking, raising hell about the Secretariat, inefficiency, etc., etc., etc. Come on. Let's just not forget that United Nations is also UNESCO, FAO, UNHCR, many other agencies that are truly important, and they will continue to be important and useful. I think David Chikwaidze during the lunch said absolutely correct thing, that the most problems are related to the Security Council. But we cannot change. And if you cannot change something, what do you do with that? You trash it. You trash it. I'm not saying that we should trash the Security Council and the United Nations, but we should think how to adopt the organization or rebuild the organization or change it completely, drastically from the scratch. And in Russia, currently, it's a difficult time. Ukraine has lost 70 million people as refugees. Do you know how many Russians emigrated for the same period? 2 million from the country, because the people are in disagreement with what is going on. You will be asking why they do not protest. You should have asked the same question the Pinochet in Chile and in other dictatorial regimes. Simply, this is not possible. That's why I agree completely that the only thing that could be done is defeat the regime, today's regime of Russia. But let's be clear, I've heard many times today that Russia should be defeated, Ukraine should win, should carry victory, etc. What do you call victory for Ukraine? What do you call defeat for the regime? The devil is in the details. If we do not answer this question, we can talk until midnight with all these issues. Sorry, I've taken too much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was not only very insightful, but I think there are a couple of aspects, at least a couple of aspects on which I hope we could elaborate later in the conversation. But I would like to ask the people in charge of the technical aspects to call in Mr. Wang Chao, the president of the People's Institute of Foreign Affairs, calling in from Beijing, I think. I don't see anybody. Yeah. Hello. Good evening. Must be very late for you, Mr. Wang Chao, at least late.
Prime Minister, I think it's all right. It's 8 o'clock in
8
Beijing.
o'clock, which is, that's still feasible. That's still 2 hours before the night owl sessions here, or at least the one of yesterday. Of course, the center of gravity of the world is shifting to the east. A bit to my surprise this morning, even the word China was not mentioned when we were talking about the war in Ukraine and the aggression by Russian leadership towards unjustified aggression towards Ukraine. We are now talking about rebuilding a global security architecture, and of course the voice and the vision of China will be key today and tomorrow to engineer such a global security architecture, if it is possible to engineer one. So I would like to give you the floor, to give your views, 5-6 minutes, on what is happening and how you see this as a very important Chinese thinker. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister. Many thanks to the Zami Ganjavi International Center for the invitation. And I think it's a great honor for me to attend the 9th Qlobal Bakı Forum. I also feel very glad to talk with friends whom I just met last year, and also there are some new to me this year, though it's through video. Though the theme of this panel, I think, is very important. It does demonstrate that the world needs peace more than any time. Indeed, very unfortunately, compared with last year, the global security situation is more complex and is daunting. Now we have the pandemic, we have regional conflicts, we have major power rivalry, sluggish economy, and climate change. So all these things are in front of us. The world now is undergoing an unprecedented time with unprecedented risk of division and confrontation. So it is very pressing, or it is a pressing task for the international community to address these challenges I mentioned. And we must find out a way to address these crises. Now I have some observations. First, we should establish the awareness of living in the same security community and advocate a new vision of global security. Now we are facing the complex and volatile international situation. And on the April 21st, at the Boao Forum for Asia, Chinese President Xi Jinping proposed a solution. The solution is the Global Security Initiative. So this initiative advocates that the whole world, or the human society, should stay committed to the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and work together to to maintain world peace and security, to stay committed to respecting the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of all countries, uphold non-interference in internal affairs, and respect the independent choices of development paths of social system made by people in different countries. Stay committed to abiding by the purposes and the principles of the UN Charter, reject the Cold War mentality, oppose unilateralism, and say no to group politics and bloc confrontation. Stay committed to taking the legitimate security concerns of all countries seriously. Uphold the principle of indivisible security, build a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture, and oppose the pursuit of one's own security at the cost of the other's security. Stay committed to peaceful resolving differences and disputes between countries through dialogue and consultation. Support all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of crises. Reject double standards and oppose wanton use of unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. Stay committed to maintaining security in both traditional and non-traditional domains, and work together to regional disputes and global challenges such as terrorism, climate change, cybersecurity, and biosecurity. This is the practical solution China proposed to both solve the current security problems and achieve enduring world peace. And my second observation is that we must uphold true multilateralism and strengthen solidarity and cooperation. This is an important route to enduring peace and security. To practice true multilateralism, we should uphold international system with the United Nations at its core, and international system with the United Nations and the international order underpinned by international law and the basic norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the United Nations. On the UN issue, China's position is very clear. That is, the status and the role of the United Nations is irreplaceable, which can only be strengthened but not weakened. Some countries with the Cold War and the zero-sum games mentality are constantly forming new blocs and circles. This is absolutely pseudo-multilateralism. The world is going through difficult times, so no country can address global challenges alone or on its own. The international community, more than ever, needs true multilateralism to jointly safeguard global security and development. My third observation is that we must uphold new vision of security and seek political solution on the Ukraine issue. We are all very concerned about the situation in Ukraine. The causes of the conflict are complex. The crux is that some countries cling to the Cold War mentality and seek their absolute security at the expense of the others. On the Ukraine issue, China's position has been dedicated to promoting dialogue and peace talks, and show disapproval of using war and sanctions to address disputes. China has called on all parties outside the region not to add fuel to the fire. But it's a pity that under the interference of external forces, the conflicts has been much intensified. So faced with the era of great changes unseen in a century and the turmoil of the current world, China, as a responsible major country, proposed the Global Security Initiative. That reflects the spirit of the UN Charter. And the initiative is the Chinese wisdom and a solution to the global security challenges. So those are my three observations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Chao. I think there are at least a couple of aspects on which I hope we can elaborate it at a later stage, like the principle of non-interference, to understand it very rightly. And then, of course, what this Global Security Initiative means in the short term for the situation, the aggression, Russian aggression towards Ukraine. But we will try to have sufficient time to come back to that. I would like to give the floor to Royal Highness Prince Turki, who is leading as a chairman of the board, the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. I could imagine which will bring an analysis that is maybe different from another geographical point of view, at least outside of this region, not in Europe, not in the US, not in Russia, not in China. Please, you have the floor, but an important one. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. First of all, my thanks to President Aliyev and the Janjaweed Forum and the BAKU Forum and the co-chairs of the BAKU Forum for inviting me to attend here. What I heard before in the previous session in this room, actually, I weep for the Ukrainian people. I weep for their suffering, for their dislocation, for their heroism. And I also repeat what my country's voting at the General Assembly resolution on the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that it is not only unacceptable, but it is totally contrary to international law and the rules-based system that we live in today. But ladies and gentlemen, as mentioned by others, I also weep for other people who have suffered aggression, whether in the Middle East, whether in Africa, whether in Asia, or anywhere in the world. And if I may say, bullies come in different sizes and shapes. Whether it is the invasion of Iraq in 2003, or the occupation of Palestine, or the non-application of United Nations Security Council resolutions on Kashmir, or the suffering of the Rohingya in Myanmar. I can go on, and the list is endless. So I'm glad that the world, as was mentioned, or perhaps more particularly, Europe and the West, are awoken now to the fact that such suffering should not be endured and should not continue, and that there must be a reform of the United Nations system. But how are we going to do that when the people who devised that system have the power to prevent us from reforming it? They're the ones with the power of veto that allows for reform or non-reform. Alas, the General Assembly, whatever resolutions it takes, and respectfully, it has taken many resolutions, but no implementation. And it is because of that that I may suggest one step, hopefully, that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council can add to the Security Council system in addition to the veto power that they share, which is that once a United Nations Security Council resolution is passed, then subsequent resolutions to implement that resolution should not be vetoed. That is one way that we can have resolutions implemented, if they agree. And that's the problem. So we hear about what the United Nations should do. We hear about what the Security Council could do. And we hear even sometimes what they can do and what they wish to do. But particularly in the past couple of decades, what did they do? That is the important question. It's not a matter of wishing and willing and hoping for something to be done. And if you talk the talk and don't walk the walk, what good are you? So, on these questions that are in the prospects for this panel, one of them says that we will still adhere to non-interference in the domestic affairs of individual sovereign states, or is there a duty to respond to humanitarian challenges and to protect human rights? That's a finely worded sentence, but it's loaded with dynamite. Because who is to decide what is and what is not humanitarian challenge to be protected? We go back to that question. And I beg to say that once the issues of non-interference of the affairs of, in the affairs of states became a principle of international law, if we break that principle, no holds are barred then. And we'll see countries going at each other's throats, claiming that they're doing it for ulterior and humanitarian reasons. So I'd rather be very careful in giving up on some of these international law rules and keep them for the sake of not going at each other's throats. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The gender balance in this panel is very much opposed to this morning, so but Tzipi Livni is here as an experienced politician, Minister of Foreign Affairs, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, and a very well-known analyst of situations in her region, but more globally speaking, worldwide. So we are keen to listen to your view on what the state of play is and what kind of ways solutions could be engineered. Please.
I will address the global. If I may, I would like to address the global situation. I will refer also to the Middle East, but I think that this is very important. And well, we can all agree about the nature of multilateralism, the importance, the fact that it is based on shared interests, shared values, understanding of solidarity between nations, reciprocity, understanding of common challenges and acting together in order to meet these challenges. It is also clear that after the horrors of the Second World War, the United Nations was established under the slogan of never again. And from economic perspective, the IMF, the World Bank, and other organizations in order to implement this vision. And after the defeat or the victory of the Second World War, it was the obvious. And this created the common denominator between countries, basically democratic countries that share the same set of values. It needs to be said that even before the invasion of Russia to the Ukraine, multilateralism was challenged and questioned. By the way, it was questioned also by the leader of the free world when Trump was the president, and he decided, for example, to stop financing the World Health Organization at the midst of pandemic, acting against the nature of the United Nations, whether it's the Secretariat or other, like there is no need to act together, America first, and all these things. Another challenge came from young generation, that for them democracy is the obvious. They were born after the horrors of the Second World War, and they questioned the system. And nationalistic movements try to, in a way, exploit fear and hatred into more authoritarian leadership on the expense of understanding that globalization, that unfortunately also created gaps within society and between nations. At first also the idea was to spread technology and wealth. So this was the challenge, but the invasion of Russia to the Ukraine really shocked, and not only because this is in the midst of Europe, but it came from a country who was part of this understanding, P5 in the United Nations, Security Council, veto rights in the United Nations, and this kind of atrocities and pictures that we saw and raping, this is something that, okay, we saw it in the world, but usually it came from terrorist organizations that are not part of us, of being part of the modern world. And now this is happening by Russian soldiers. So this is still a shock against the international law, against everything that we believe in, and until this invasion, Russia was part of it. Some would say that the comfort is that it's very clear what's right and wrong, who are the bad guys and the good guys, and the entire world support the Ukraine. And I heard also the words here about victory, about the day after the victory. I would like to put some question marks, if I may, instead of the exclamation marks. And it is clear that NATO, that was also created after the Second World War as part of the transatlantic alliance, is expanding, is stronger. We see united Europe, united NATO. But I want to ask a question. Is the idea of being part of this global society is just being a member, official member of NATO? Because frankly, if Russia would, hopefully not, or had attacked a NATO member, it is clear that the support would not be just a moral or sending weapon support, but really participating in this. When it was said on the stage that this is a kind of Chamberlain position, if this is really the situation, so can we afford, and I'm really asking questions, can we afford just, sitting on the balcony in a way? And I think that these are questions that need to be asked, because some of the conclusion to other parts of the world is that, okay, if this is the situation, so we should take care of ourselves. And I'm not talking about Israel, because Israel never asked or think about US forces on Israeli soil. This is not our position and never was. And speaking about our region, we have new alliances. Abraham Accords are really a game changer. It's really a new Middle East. We need to solve the conflict with the Palestinians, of course. It's part of our interest, I believe, and responsibility, but yet we understand we have a common threat coming from Iran, and we can cooperate on this. But the situation in Europe affects also position on other countries in terms of their own security. Now, it is quite comforting that the world, well, I don't want to use the world, because when we say the world or the international community, refers to ourselves. Usually it doesn't include China or part of Asia or Africa or Latin America. And this is part of a problem, because when we speak about multilateralism, we are speaking about nations that have the same common value. And my question is whether when we are facing these kind of threats, I'm not speaking now about security threats, but when we are speaking about climate change and about hunger, this will turn into conflicts. It will not remain just, something that is less than security needs. It's part of it. And the question, and unfortunately speaking about the situation in Europe, there is a nuclear deterrence, let's face it. So I think that in order to meet this challenge, at first we need to understand the realities on the ground, not just speak and think in terms of hope and what we wish that would happen, because this is the only way to give an answer to. The United Nations, unfortunately, is not functioning, and it's not only waiting for reforms in the United Nations. It is more problematic than this and need to be addressed. And I don't want to take much more time, but I know that the question of young generation and social networks was raised before as a tool to spread hatred or to send wrong facts or lies. But I suggest that we will use the social networks and act with the young generation, that frankly for them what we are speaking here, these are the old guys that speaking about the World War II, about the Atlantic Charter. This is not part of their life, but they can influence leaders. And if the leaders will not take the responsibility and act in accordance to what was suggested here, understanding of the United Nations Charter and solidarity and according to what is right and not supporting these wrong things, so they can be very influential on leaders if we can cooperate and use these tools also, not just sharing this idea in this wonderful stage. And thank you, the Nizami Jinjavi International Center, President Aliyev, and not less important, excuse me, but Rovshan Muradov, that after his sleepless nights, we can gather here today and speak about all these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think it would be nice to come back on the role of media, social media, and interaction with younger generations and other people, also based on the interesting conversation in difficult circumstances that Paul Ravai was skillfully leading on the role of social media in situations of war. I would like now, Mr. President, turn to you as the former president of Georgia, and as board member Eka has, I think, rightly mentioned, a kind of pioneering in the situation of being aggressed by Russia, and you experience yourself what role regional and international institutions and allies can play or don't play when a country like Georgia is attacked and is subject to such kind of aggression. Please.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the Nizami Ganjavi International Center for really getting us together. I mean, we've been getting on Zoom, we've been signing very important petitions, I believe, but it is great to be back in Baku, and thank you for giving me this possibility. Well, I want to address the issue that everyone is talking about naturally today, and this is Ukraine. Or to take it broader, it's the broken European security, the European security that has been demolished now by Russia's aggression, and a security that will be probably rebuilt after Ukraine wins the war, but still we don't know how and with what principles it has to be rebuilt. So to go a little bit back and to understand what were the problems built in this system, I would like to start really from the moment, from one historic moment, and it goes back also to Ukraine, by the way. It is President Bush visiting Kiev in 1995 and then addressing Ukrainian still sort of Soviet council. And it was full of patriotism, but President Bush's address was concentrated on attempt to maintain somehow Soviet Union. And it talked to Ukrainians, which were sort of very excited about new possibility of creating independent Ukraine, and calling this a toxic nationalism. Because this was a time and period of history where there was a vision that we can rebuild the Soviet Union. It was a great time of Bush's visit to Soviet Union, his great time of friendship with Gorbachev, who I believe is a great leader. But at this moment, understanding the situation as a toxic nationalism was not properly understanding history, not properly understanding what would happen to Soviet Union very soon. And that soon started in a couple of weeks when there was a coup d'etat in Soviet Union, something that we call putsch. And Gorbachev was captured, and then when he came back, he was not able to rebuild the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union collapsed. But at the same time, there was something new created as CIS to try to unite the countries that were in economic cooperation, and that also didn't work. So how this whole thing started was that our allies, with which we had very good relationships at that moment of history, didn't really have a vision what should happen out of the center or the empire of evil, as I believe Reagan called it, and how it should be restructured and put into new life. It didn't work with Gorbachev, who had visions about this, but it didn't work afterwards with the Commonwealth of Independent States as well. So then another benchmark, I think, is what we should consider is a 2007 year Munich speech of President Putin. And that is the moment when there is already a new vision to what has to happen to something that Russia started calling near neighborhood. So imagine Soviet Union collapses, there is no vision on what has to happen, but then there is a new vision, and this vision does not come from our friends and allies. This vision comes from a person who has ideas that today has been many times called archaic, medieval. But something happens before that, and that something is also very important for us today as well. That is the 1994 Budapest Agreement. An agreement which is totally in the spirit that we are rebuilding a new world, where everyone will live in peace. And during this moment, Ukraine dismantles its nuclear arsenal. So imagine what kind of world we were building in the 90s, that we believed that everything would be peaceful and no one would need nuclear arms to protect themselves. And suddenly we get year 2007 that then is continued with year 2008 and an aggression, a war against Georgia. That is continued with year 2014, aggression against Ukraine and aggression against Ukraine again, and annexation of Crimea. So, 2 minutes? So, at this point, I believe we are still floating without a vision of what this security in this part of the world should mean. We are floating without a vision on one side, on the side of our allies, on the side of the free world, and we are slammed with a vision of an imperialistic Russia that is willing to commit its people, its economy, its future, just for terrorizing its nearest neighbors. So, I mean, talking about past makes only sense when you're thinking about future, and the future is what has to happen in Ukraine. And let me just put small points about this. if this war has any successful outcome for Russia, any success that Russia can present to itself, our lives, not only in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, or in Ukraine, will be a disaster, but this will be a real blow to the European as well as world order. And I'm talking now not about the rule-based world order, but the nuclear order, because we will have a precedent where a leader is declaring absolutely unacceptable, absolutely anti-human, absolutely illogical, even in context of war, goals, and is keeping his finger on this imaginary red button. And what do? We somehow let it roll. So, not even with Putin, but even after Putin, this will become a covenant for future leaders, that's how you have to act. So now Ukrainians are dying for our security, for security of Georgians, for security of Europeans, for security primarily for future of Ukraine. But believe me, if they don't succeed, this security is not going to be nowhere in the world. Primarily around us, and of course elsewhere, because there are much more red buttons appearing on the different parts of the globe. So this will be a manual for any leader. Hold your finger and present your demands. We have to do something about it, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hajiev, this is, so to say, a home play for you. Azerbaijan, I think, not the least through initiatives like NGIC, is profiling itself with a clear view on international relations, playing a stabilizing role in the region, being a trustworthy partner for the international community. Yesterday, in a conversation the board had with President Aliyev, we just pointed, amongst other things, at the role of the non-aligned countries. So given not only the blockage within P5, but just the behavior of one P5 member and this clash between rules-based approaches and then the brutal use of power, how do you see, what is the role, what is the, let's say, what are the objectives of President Aliyev, Azerbaijan, to help to come closer to sustainable reform of the UN system and a better global security guarantee?
Thank you, Chairman. Also, thank you for the distinguished panel. It's always difficult to be the last speaker, but I will try. One of the biggest achievements of the international community in the last century, among the two fundamental failures, that was in World War I and World War II, it was first codification of the international system, and it was second institutionalization of the international relations. Codification as a result of the First World War, and mainly after the Second World War, international relations codified based on the norms and principles of international law. For the first time in the history of humankind, there was certain rules, regulations, fundamental norms and principles of international law, but every country has committed herself under the book. That book is not in a Bible, it's not in a Quran, but this book was a charter of the United Nations. Second biggest achievement of the international community was the institutionalization. We started with the League of Nations, but unfortunately it failed and the Second World War started. But after the Second World War, there was a proliferation of international organization, institutionalization of the international relations. To an extent, it provided peace and security, at least a relative peace and security in the international system. It was one of the two biggest, at least from my perspective, biggest achievement of the international community. But 1991, disintegration of the Soviet Union, at least I can speak on behalf of Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan becomes an independent country. And with institutions and with the norms and principles of international law designed before Azerbaijan's independence. And it was a romantic period of Azerbaijan's diplomacy as a relatively new country entering to the system of international relations. We also had a certain naivety with regard to these institutions. While joining with institutions, we thought that this institution will provide peace, security, and prosperity for Azerbaijan. but unfortunately, nothing happened. On the early days of Azerbaijan independence, Azerbaijan faced with the foreign military aggression, occupation of its territories, and ethnic cleansing of its nationals. Now comes another issue that sometimes we see a little bit frustration and disappointment in Azerbaijani society. Of course, we fully understand all the realities and hardships and the crisis in Ukraine, but 30 years ago, Azerbaijan faced its own crisis that neighboring Armenia, being the member of the international institutions, being member of the OSCE, being the member of the Council of Europe, and so on and so forth, occupies sovereign territory of another country, but all international community, I'm sorry to say, was on a silent, as if nothing happens. But Azerbaijan pleading to all international institutions to say the things with their original name. Even OSCE Minsk Group co-chair countries, they're permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, they didn't have any courage to say that it's an occupation. And I personally challenged them, and everyone from Azerbaijani diplomacy said that if it's an occupation, tell an occupation. And then United Nations Security Council adopted 4 resolutions reaffirming Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and sovereignty and demanding immediate, unconditional and full withdrawal of Armenian troops from Azerbaijan's occupied territories. And we waited for 30 years for the implementation, and finally, and we understand that it's the end of the, for us it was the end of the international system. And for us it was the end of the norms and principles of international law. We understood that by our own means, by our own capabilities, we should fulfill United Nations Security Council resolutions. But now I'm pleased to see that finally old Europe understood that territorial integrity is a sacrosanct principle. Unfortunately, there was a double standards with regard to Azerbaijan, and there was also selective application of its principles. When there was a statement from the European Union or some other institutions with regard to other protracted conflicts in post-Soviet area, there was always said that we fully support territorial integrity of this and that country. But when it came to Azerbaijan, there was a complete silence. Therefore, for us, it was yet another crisis of multilateralism and crisis of the international system. I also take this opportunity to thank particularly 3 countries. They understand the hardship and challenge of Azerbaijan. That was the Republic of Turkey, that was an Islamic Republic of Pakistan, that was a Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Based on the norms and principles of international law, they didn't establish diplomatic relations with the Republic of Armenia and keeping high the norms and principles of international law. Then another question is that, can we see the world without United Nations and without multilateralism? First, about the key concept of multilateralism. I think that multilateralism should be available, should be alive, and should be protracted, and should be developed. Why? Especially from the perspectives of the relatively small and mid-sized countries. Multilateralism provided the countries with the size of Azerbaijan, for example, to be equal and sovereign member of the international community. And it also provided us another platform to speak and to express our views, and within the certain international institutions. And here comes another institution with the first universal organization, United Nations. And of course, we can criticize United Nations for many reasons. But one issue we should separate. There are different chapters and baskets within the United Nations. On the development chapter, on some other humanitarian chapter, there is a success stories as well, especially providing cooperation among the member countries on certain specialized areas of cooperation that cannot be divided. Most important component is missing is a peace and security chapter, but mainly under the auspices and under the responsibility of the United Nations Security Council. Security Council design is actually, it's not my word, it's a word of the people who have designed Security Council of that period of time, but it's in a concept of the 5 policemen, but actually designed to endorse the realities of the status quo as established as a result of the Second World War. But status quo cannot live longer. First, Security Council geographically is not fair represented, and also in terms of the substance, in terms of the methodology, it's not fair at all. But what's in a solution, but solution also in the book, the Charter of the United Nations, and there are certain areas needs to be revisited, and also geographical representation is as a one important step forward to go. And I really applaud the recent initiative in the UN General Assembly, where finally international community came closer and adopted one resolution. In case of the veto, UN permanent representative should come to the General Assembly and report to the General Assembly what was the reason for issuing the veto. But with regard to the non-aligned movement, I think that really, once again, thanks to the founding fathers of the non-alignment movement. And when non-alignment movement established, there wasn't such a principle international system. Either you are together with us or you are against us. Unfortunately, we see such a tendency again. And there is always importance of the third way in international affairs. And we think that non-aligned movement can provide such an alternative as a third way. Because East-West confrontation, unfortunately, will last longer. North-South cooperation is not working. At least South-South cooperation that non-aligned movement provides as a platform can work, as Azerbaijan as a chairing country is also trying to fulfill its obligations. We are entering the new world, as it was said by my president yesterday meeting with the board, and the world is changing dynamically. Unfortunately, we are not so flexible, we are not so rapid to adapt to these realities. Especially COVID-19 was an alarm for all of us to be more adapted to these realities. Yet another issue with regard to the COVID-19. COVID-19 was lasting almost for many months. There was no universal reaction. Finally, it was Azerbaijan, on behalf of the NAM, we raised an issue, and we're also thankful to all NAM countries about a special session of the United Nations, at least to provide a solidarity. Simply, my final remark is that, do we need to design something, or do we need to design or reinvent a bicycle? I think no, we are not talking about reinventing bicycle. Certain principles and certain rules are already in place, but we should recommit themselves and we should adapt them to these new realities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to invite people in the room that have a pressing question to just be patient for another couple of minutes, but I think we will have time to take 2-3 questions. I would like, in a waiting, to come back to a statement by Mr. Likotal, and also Tsipi Livni referred to social media. Yesterday, Mr. Likotal, during the night old session, I think you were present, colleague Espinosa gave a kind of analysis of what, to her opinion at least, are the reasons of the failure of United Nations system, or at least Security Council. And the first reason was the non-implementation of resolutions and the lack of credibility due to that. And the non-implementation was linked by colleague Espinosa, was linked to the lack of social ownership. I would like to make a reference to the 2 million people, as you mentioned, that left Russia because they don't agree with what the regime is doing. And I think it's important to make a distinction between the Russians, the Russian population, and the leadership. It's the leadership that is currently acting. Do you think, referring also to the remark of Tsipi Livni, that this is a kind of element we should take into account in improving the UN system to be more concrete? Shouldn't we take into account the fact that in the 21st century, number one, warfare is extended, not only land, sea, air, but also information war? And secondly, that 21st century, people are differently educated, have more information, insight, opinions, want to express them. So, to put a long story short, or a long question short, is improving that social ownership via a good connection with, better connection with citizens of a nation, of a country, world citizens. Is that a way to improve the functioning and the implementation of Security Council resolutions? I see you nodding skeptically, but please, yeah.
For this question, but you know, I'm maximalistic in my approach in this area, because I think that today the world has outlived the system of the world management that existed before. Actually, we're living in the Westphalian and post-Westphalian system with the sovereign states, etc., etc. There were several departures from the idea of sovereignty. The Hague Tribunal, Criminal Court, then finally, most recent in 2005, there was adopted principle that by the United Nations Summit, after the United Nations General Assembly, there was the Heads of State Summit, and they adopted the R2P principle, responsibility to protect. It's a very good idea, in fact, but it was a departure from Westphalia. But at the end of the day, this good idea was completely inversed by various dictatorial regimes, including Russia today. Because what they claim, somebody said that, well, I think President Yushchenko said about that Russia has thousands of people outside Russia. No, not thousands, 25 million live outside Russia. And that gives now the pretext, practically, using this convention, using this principle to get to the domestic affairs of the country where they live, under the pretext that this principle doesn't work, that the governments cannot protect the citizens, and they must do something. I mean, Russia. That's, by the way, the most favorable argument of Russia today with its aggression in Ukraine. The east part of Ukraine, the Russian population, etc., etc. What I'm talking, we need to change the system. You said about the social capital. It's just patching something which doesn't hold water at all today. We need to go much further to that. The idea that the international relations should be based on the relations of the states and governments is obsolete and dangerous, and that's what we see now. We need to move to the idea from the international to intersocial relations. And the first steps, by the way, maybe you did not notice, they were already taken. France, Denmark, they have established the position of ambassadors at Amazon, Microsoft, Apple. Why? Because the foreign minister of Denmark commented very, convincingly. He said, the decisions of this company have an impact on our country more than the decisions of the majority of the states in the world. And that is happening. We are talking about the role of the corporations. We are talking about the role of the social communities. And the future world system, if we will want to have the future system, will necessarily get away from the pattern of the interstate relationship. Because actually it has been in existence for roughly 350 years. Before that it has never existed. And nothing lasts forever under the moon.
Thank you. That's food for thought. Sipi, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that we should give young generation a vision. They need to feel connected, or that this will be part of their identity, not only national identity, but why they should or will feel part of the international community and its values. We don't need to reinvent this vision, but we need in a way to rebrand it and to use social networks. By the way, speaking about the social, you know what is the moment in which Zelensky became a leader in the international community? This one. When he was in the streets with this T-shirt, using his iPhone, this was the moment in which young people in Tel Aviv and in Europe started to feel connected to this guy who is fighting for his country, and this became the trend also in European streets, and leaders start acting. So it is clear that it's quite difficult because information, sometimes it's disinformation. By the way, speaking about Russia, this is why Putin cut social networks, because he didn't want Russians to get information which is different than the propaganda that he is selling. But I believe that in the future, not just connected to the Ukraine, but in general, our generation needs also to give a sense of identity, which is not only I am a citizen of my country and I'm proud of my country, is something that I call globalization. And my country is part of the international community, part of its values, and will fight or act together in order to meet the challenges that we are all facing. And speaking about it, just last 2 sentences, I think that now we are focusing on strengthening the current alliance. I think that the challenge is how to broaden this alliance. I would like to see China, because the next thing that we are facing now is the Cold, maybe not the Cold War, but between the US and China. And this is something, it's like the US is asking now other parts of the world to make the decision between the two, or the choice between the two. And I think that since we are facing challenges that we need the entire international, meeting climate change cannot be just by the Western world, or meeting hunger, or meeting all these challenges. And therefore, I think that the common denominator should be found in order to have more and more on board, and not just to strengthen the current alliance.
Thank you. That's very interesting remarks. Of course, social media also fuel populism and demagoguery and so on. I don't know if President Chou from Beijing wants to intervene, not for a personal reason, but at least China was mentioned. I don't know if Mr. Chou is online on what Mrs. Livni said, or do you want to react on that? Yes, please.
Well, just now China was mentioned. China was mentioned, and it referred to the the rival between China and the United States. Well, in fact, China is a peace-loving country. It has never invaded other countries, well, since the last, well, for the last 70 years, more than 70 years. We have not occupied one country, 1 inch of just a piece of land from other countries. But now the United States have created many problems for China. It wants to suppress China. Now there are many blocks just around China. So these blocks are created, well, by the Cold War mentality, because they still hold the Cold War mentality, though now we are in the 21st century. So there are a number of small blocks, like a Quad, like AUKUS. So these have a very, well, accurate, or I say just very targeting objective. So now I think, you know, just because of these things the United States has done, so it has made many countries very painful. They must decide, or they have to decide for some time, just to choose which side they are going to be on. Though they are loving peace, they want to, you know, have a peaceful coexistence, you know, with China and with, you know, the United States. But the cold mentality did create, or has created, many of the problems. And now I would also like just, you know, to mention some of the things just on the, well, Ukraine issue.
Briefly, please. Yes.
Yeah.
I can come back to you after a couple of questions from the audience, if you allow me. I will come back to you. Petre, you raised, yeah, please. Is there a microphone?
Okay. There are two.
Petre Roman.
Yeah, thank you. A few days ago, President Putin put himself in the shoes of Peter the Great. and said that Russia has the right to reconquer, to put back, to bring back territories which belonged sometimes to Russia. By the way, after the great victory of Peter the Great against Sweden, he suffered a great defeat in the war with the Ottoman Empire in 1711, by the way. But something very dramatic happened, because in saying that, Putin, for the first time after the death of Stalin, a Russian leader is no more interested in the international rule, international legality. Khrushchev was very strongly in favor of international legality and the loving and the peace-loving man. Brezhnev, Gorbachev, of course, and Yeltsin. But now, for the first time, a Russian leader says, international legality is not for me. What's the meaning of peace? What's the meaning of peaceful resolution of conflicts under this condition? We are moving towards a rule-based disorder, meaning that every powerful state is coming, imposing its own rules. It's a rule-based disorder. So what's the meaning of peace? Again, what's the meaning of peace or peaceful resolution of conflicts under this? Remember that how hugely far, I'm finished, how hugely far we are now from those, 15 years ago, when Russia said that maybe it is interested to join NATO. Remember? It was really possible.
Someone else wants to, yes, please? Yeah. So these three, and then we go back to the panel for...
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Origin from Afghanistan, living in Switzerland. Just my remark about the NATO. How we can believe in NATO, that they have commitment to the population of Afghanistan. After 22 years, they left Afghanistan without any justification. And how Ukrainian people can trust United States and all members of the NATO that they can continue to support Europe, democracy, and also the sovereignty of the Ukraine, because they speak and they maybe tomorrow left they left Afghanistan. This is my remark from all of the speakers. If you can just develop about that, what is the future? Today they support, what will tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow for supporting Europe or Ukrainian people. Thank you very much.
Madam, please.
That was my first question. My second question...
Save time.
Yeah. We heard a lot about...
Can you maybe present yourself?
I'm Hakima El Haiti. I'm from Morocco. I'm the president of Liberal International based in London. My question, we heard a lot about reforming NATO yesterday night. We were discussing how to make the United Nations more efficient, more peacekeeper, etc., etc. And we hear today all what our outstanding speakers said. But I'm wondering, what is the solution now? What immediately we should do? There is a war in the back door of Europe. To reform any institution, we need time. You will not reform the United Nations or the Council of Security tomorrow morning. What is the solution? How can we act and react to what is happening now in the world. And we see that the resolutions taken in United Nations are without any impact on Putin action. While we are talking now, Russian bombs are raining on Ukraine and killing people. So what to do now? What can you propose to do now? What calls this forum will give to the international community?
Thank you. I just fear that we need more than 75 minutes to have a beginning of an answer to that question. But we have 3 points raised. The last one maybe first, President? Yeah.
I'll try to be very short. And of course, those discussions are very valuable, and they are going to lay a ground for future architecture of Europe and to think what were the faults. But now, life is much more easier. It is very easy because Ukrainians are doing it easy for us. They are fighting for this security. So now life is pretty easy. Ban Russia, try to get from the Russian oil and gas, fulfill the land lease, and finally, Ukrainians are doing an enormous gift to all humankind. They just need to get weapons. This is a very easy moment in history when it is war. You just have to fight. So the land lease should start acting, and Russia should be defeated in Ukraine. And not face saved, and not verstehen Putin, but simply defeated. It was very well presented by the US Minister of Defense, defeated to the extent where it cannot exercise aggression to its neighbors. When we come to that point, with the courage and bravery of our Ukrainian allies, which they are doing, then we can start thinking about what was wrong and how to reconstruct. But now it's easy.
Thank you very much. On the point of the reform, maybe Tsipi, you want to add something? No? Yes?
The answer, if we cannot now, we are not going to recreate another organization or to make tomorrow the reforms in the United Nations. I think that the urgent thing is to, in order to meet the new challenges, now I'm not speaking about Russia and Ukraine, but climate change and hunger and health, is to make an ad hoc alliances per thing that need to be addressed, and the alliance should be in the lowest common denominator in order to have more and more countries on board. I think that the role of the US is utmost important, and it will be in some of the, if the United Nations can support, or the United Nations organization, not the General Assembly or the Security Council. And I think that the role of the United States in creating this kind of like-minded alliance is very important.
Mr. Likotaal, you wanted to?
I'd like to say that the question could be split in two: what to do in order to stop the war, and what to do in order to start building the new system of international of the world order. The first one, I think that the sanctions do not work. Unfortunately, I see it, and currently, regardless of all the sanctions, Russia is getting more money than before the war, because of different mechanisms, but it still continues. I'm afraid that sanctions on the oil and everything will not work either. And today, as I understand, I'm not an economist, so I do not have a firm position on that, but I know that the more and more economists are talking about the necessity to impose much higher customs, kind of, I don't know how it is called, taxes, or for selling the oil. And that will be totally different, because if oil embargo exists, Russia will definitely find through the second, through the third parties to sell this oil. Now they reload the oil in the oceans, in the seas, to another tankers and mix it a little bit with another oil and sell it as a different oil already. That is happening. So what could end the war? The war could be finished only on the battlefield. And unfortunately today, though I must recognize that the West, particularly the United States and Europe, of course, are doing a lot to support Ukraine. It's undeniable, because the price of the war for Ukraine, with not that big economy, is astounding. And Ukraine gets support, financial support to support its budget, and military support. But at the same time, military support is provided in the scale that to enable Ukraine not to lose, but not to enable it to win. So I think that should be reversed. I mean, it should be different. Ukraine should provide, the West should provide all necessary equipment to equip Ukraine to win the war. But again, the question of winning. Some hotheads are saying that Ukrainian flag on the Kremlin. Some returning to the pre-2014, that means to returning Ukraine, Donbass and everything. I think that both options, both attempts will trigger immense reaction from Russia. What is possible is to enable Ukraine to free the territory, including Donbass. And as Zelensky himself recognized, he is ready to postpone the solution of Crimea for the future. I think that's the way to finish the war. With the world order, it is much more protracted, it is much more difficult, and I don't think that the conferences today, what we see is an attempt to return to the new iteration of a system based on the balance of power. And today, the idea is to create a kind of a hybrid version of the concert which existed after the Vienna conference and the superpower control, and create two camps. One is democratic, free world, and authoritarian world. I am afraid that will lead nowhere. What is needed? Totally different approach. We should not be just, patching the holes on the current system. Whatever we do with the recombination of the existing elements of the now existing world system will not work, or it helped to win a couple of years, couple of decades, but it will not last forever. What is needed? New system from the scratch, including intersocial elements.
Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to Ms. Hagiev, just asking Mr. Chow to be prepared if he wants to still intervene to conclude this panel. And I will also invite Prince Turki if he wants to add something to what has been said. Mr. Hagiev, first you raised the finger.
Thank you. Think about in the last 20 years, we had 3 important watershed developments, but unfortunately we didn't get proper lessons learned. And first one was on 9/11. And 9/11, and we thought that we will find a solution to the theoretical clash of civilization. Unfortunately, it continued deepen clash of civilization. And second important development was about the COVID-19, and it was a warning call with all its repercussions, to learn lessons learned, and it was also set new elements of the new world order, but unfortunately we also failed to get proper lessons learned. And February 21st and developments and afterwards, but also face us with new developments. But I don't want to sound a little bit pessimistic, but I'm rather cautious optimistic. But unfortunately, certain things will get worse until they get better. The crisis in Ukraine or COVID-19, as COVID-19 experience demonstrated us that with the emergence of the COVID-19 or yet another crisis in Ukraine doesn't make disappear our other problems or provide a condition for their aggravation. Therefore, we are on the threshold of yet another energy problems, or I don't want to call it energy crisis, but challenges are obvious, and global food crisis, and migration issues, and it will also have long-term repercussions on the global health issues. And these issues are combined. And also, yet another important element with regard to institutionalization of international relations, and all of these institutions are designed particularly with the sole purpose about prevention. Our prevention mechanism failed, and we had multiple crises, and also one crisis could have a potential spillover crisis in some part of the other parts of the world as well. And what are the solutions? Of course, we can't have a crystal ball here, but one of the immediate conditions, I think, that UN General Assembly can provide an honest platform, but all international community should come together and to discuss comprehensive global security challenges and problems, and open and sincere discussion about restructuring and reforming United Nations system. With regard to the Ukrainian crisis, and I think that Azerbaijan on multiple occasions mentioned that immediate ceasefire is one of the important elements to stop the bloodshed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Chow, and then Prince Turkey. President Chow is online.
Please. Oh, yes, thank you.
Yes, please, you have the floor.
Well, I think the Ukrainian crisis is really an example of individuality of security. So that means the whole world must pay attention or attach great importance to indivisibility of security. Well, the course of the Ukrainian crisis has a very serious or very obvious underlining of the causes. So it can be traced to the expansion of NATO. We believe that after the Cold War, there should not be further expansion of military alliances or military organizations. But right now, the regional military organizations are expanding, its scope. So it not only expands, to its nearby areas. It wants to be globalized. So this should be regarded as a kind of a sign that we must pay attention to. So if we want to have the world in a secure and peaceful state, then we must pay attention to all these Cold War mentality practices. So I think the solution is there. That's President Xi's initiative. That's the global security initiative. If we can follow these principles, I think we can have a safer world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That's, I think, a lot of elements to react to, but I think we don't have time. Prince Turkey, just the last word, and then we conclude the panel.
One, coming from the Middle East and seeing how much death and destruction we've gone through in the Middle East for issues of sovereignty, of nationality, of religion, etc., etc. I'm galled by seeing how the West is saying it supports Ukraine and will not spend one person to go and fight for the Ukrainians. This to me is a total, how can I put it, cop-out. They're giving them weapons, they're telling them to fight, they're telling them they must win and everything, and yet they're not willing to sacrifice any of their children like the Ukrainians are sacrificing on the battlefront. This to me is galling. The other thing is our experience in the Middle East with fighting, especially with the state of Israel. When Israel was created back in 1948, it was given by the United Nations nearly, I think, 54% of the land of Palestine. Because the Arabs refused to engage with that United Nations, what we thought was an unjust, and I think it was unjust, now Israel practically occupies more than 80% of Palestine.
By the way, there is no state of Palestine and never created.
Well, I know that is the Israeli point of view. I'm just telling you.
For the last moment to open this discussion.
I'm just telling you my perception of this thing. And so this is for the Ukrainians to decide, not for us to tell them, yes, you must win this war or compromise on this war. Okay. They are the ones who make the decision, and we should not encourage them one way or the other, but if we can give them support in whatever manner, then let's be genuine about such support and not let them just sacrifice their children and not provide anything for them.
I agree on this.
Okay, let's then conclude on this positive note. Thank you very much for your sustained attention, and thank you to the excellent panelists for this lively conversation and discussion. Thank you very much.